We're going to address now the question of where language comes from. We haven't quite articulated what we mean by language, but let's work with our everyday understanding. Language is something particularly human. It's a means by which we communicate, perhaps think, and it seems to have made a great difference to our species, doesn't it? Look at us, we took over the entire planet, and we're in the process of destroying it, all through the wonderful medium of language. So there's been a lot of interest in knowing where this peculiar mode of signaling that's appropriate to our species came from. And when I put it in those biological terms, then one might reasonably ask, did it evolve? It might seem straightforward to you that, of course, language evolved. But remember, evolution is a biological theory about the development of form in bodies and the separation into species. It's not a theory about culture. It's not a theory about language. Darwin did not study language. But language arose. So we have justified questions asking where did it come from? And the trouble is, it doesn't need fossils. Unlike biological bodies, language does not leave fossils. So it's not quite clear what data one might bring to the table to discuss this. How would you study the origin of language? What would you look at? Well, we can look back in the record of writing, goes back about 5,000 years. But modern humans have been around for a lot longer than that, and writing was not the start of language. That much is fairly sure. But all the language used prior to writing was ephemeral. Words were spoken and they disappeared. So how would you study this? Well, there's been lots of stories. We're very good at coming up with theories. And this started in the middle of the 19th century, once the theory of biological evolution had started to make headway. People started applying these concepts to things like language, not necessarily sensibly, but imaginatively. And there were so many such stories that in 1866, the French, God love them, always trying to hold back the tides, the French Academy of Science banned theories about the evolution of language. Isn't that a surprising thing? Why would you ban theories about something we have urgent interest in? And the reason was this. We, as scientists, need to distinguish plausible scientific work from implausible scientific work. And the way we do that is through the use of evidence and observation. Science only works if the mode of argumentation leads somehow to consensus. What we are missing here is empirical evidence. As I said, the words were spoken and they vanished. When were those words better considered animal sounds? When were they better considered human language? We don't seem to have any principled handhold here. And so the French Academy of Science was trying very hard to stop pure speculation entering the scientific arena. It didn't work. It didn't work. And there's also been a lot of time since then. 1866 is a long time ago. And since then, we've thought about this an awful lot. There's been lots of possible avenues to explore. So, for example, if you want to consider the evolution of biological form, then we can ask about pre-adaptation. It's a peculiar fact about language that there's no language organ. There's no part of the body devoted to language. In speaking and in writing and in reading and in listening, we're making use of capacities of the body that have much longer evolutionary histories that are there for other purposes. There's no part of the body you can identify that's solely for language. There have been suggestions that the brain treats the sounds of speech differently from other sounds. But brain science gets murky here. And the fact that speech sounds are very important to us makes it plausible that we'll find some differences in the brain, but I'm not sure they're going to tell us an awful lot about where things came from. Language can be understood in many ways. We don't only have to look at biological form. We can also ask about its informational content, its role in communication, And these days we have tools available to us that were absolutely not available in 1866. We can, for example, run computer simulations in which little autonomous agents exchange messages, and we can vary their environment and we can change them in different ways. And we can see whether, for example, the kind of complexity that we associate with language, the symbolic complexity, the rule-like nature of sentences, whether these emerge under appropriate simulation conditions. So none of that was available. But of course, there's one place that one might try to get a handhold on this, which springs to mind, which was utterly unknown in 1866, is now part of our everyday vocabulary, and that's genetics. We said evolution is a theory about the change over time of biological form. Darwin knew nothing of genetics. Genetics and their role in variation in biological form over time was introduced to Darwinian ideas of evolution in the 20th century, giving rise to something called the new synthesis. And our understanding of genetics has changed greatly over time. Obviously, if genetics is where we look to account for change in biological form over time, then perhaps this might be a way to get a handle on language. Now, apes don't have language. We do have language. There's very little genetic difference between us and the great apes, between us and the chimpanzees, the bonobos, the gorillas, and the orangutans. So there's minimal genetic variation. So we're placing a lot of explanatory load here. It's very important at this stage to realize that the way in which genes are thought of by scientists has evolved greatly, even over the last 10 or 20 years. If you rewind the clock 20, 30 years ago, back to the 1990s, for example, you will find that genes were understood in a different manner than they are now. Genes were seen back then as if they contained information which dictated the future form of the organism. In the last 30 years, that has changed. We no longer think of genes that way. Genes are regulatory components that affect, influence, are hugely important in biological variation, but the genes themselves do not dictate or specify or contain information about the finished form of the organism. So that change is very important to note, because back in the 1990s, there were scientific arguments made about the possible roles of genetics in language development that are now implausible. So the short answer is we will never find a gene for language. But there is one interesting avenue that arose back in the 1990s. There was a family identified in England called the KE family in the medical record. They were studied intensively. There were at least 3 generations of this family, many members of which had a specific kind of a rather rare problem, which researchers interpreted to some extent as a language problem. Specifically, it was called developmental verbal dyspraxia. This relates to a difficulty in articulation, a sort of a clumsiness in pronouncing speech, if you will. That's only a small part of the overall involvement of the body in speech. But what was important here was that some members of the family had this problem, others didn't, and the pattern of inheritance matched a genetic pattern. We can spot such patterns of inheritance very, very well now. Mendelian genetics tells us the difference between recessive genes and dominant genes, and it was clear from the pattern of inheritance that there's a gene problem here. And the gene was identified. Genes have funny names. This gene is called FOXP2. So let's have a little look at FOXP2. It's found in all mammals, and it varies slightly from species to species. So even between chimpanzees and humans, we both have FOXP2 genes, but they're slightly different. And there was a single mutation on this gene, which was found to be responsible for the inherited disorder within the KE family. But although there was a strong genetic component here, was not specific to language. Those affected members of the family had a range of deficits, including delayed speech onset, cognitive deficits, learning deficits, as we might say. And furthermore, they did ultimately have perfectly fine language. So the initial enthusiasm that was displayed in the 1990s when this gene was identified as underlying the problems within this family was initially reported somewhat breathlessly. We found the gene for language, and that had to be relativized, and now it's quite clear we did not find the gene for language. FOXP2 is very important, and we know a lot more about FOXP2 now than we did back then. We know that it is a gene that influences the co-development of brain and lungs. This applies to all mammals, in mice, birds, even birds, in bats and humans. So if you have a regulatory component which is involved in the co-development of brain and lungs, it's not surprising that if something goes wrong with that, that there would be some kind of damage to the use of brain and lungs in speaking and listening, or speaking anyway. So we need to be cautious here, and we'll be doing this a lot in this course, is trying to separate out the robust scientific findings that last from those which arise more from our temporary state of knowledge, which is always improving. There was a great eagerness to report on the link between language, FOXP2, and members of the KE family, and those links were popularly expressed as, we found the language gene and we now know that no such gene exists. So I want to demonstrate this in two ways. One way is I'd like to introduce you to one member of the KE family. He put his own video up on YouTube, and I want you to just watch him and recognize what he's a beautiful character. He has language. He has multiple challenges, a learning disability, delayed language onset, still has articulation difficulties, so his speech is a little... Look, I'm not going to tell you too much about him. You have a look at him and see what you think. Does this person lack language?
Hello people, today I'm going to talk about 5 things about me. 5 things about me. Let me think. Number 1. I have a rare speech disorder called FOXPH2. If you want to know more information about that, you can. Go to Google on the KE family. I'm famous in the medical history on that. Number 2. I have a learning disability, but I can learn how to sort good things out from that. Number 3. When I was born, I learned sign language. Patrick Gorman, then I changed to Macinton, then I changed to British Sign Language. And from that, when I was young, I was non-verbal, so now I have achieved a lot in that. Number 4. I love helping people in different ways, especially hearing or deaf in the deaf community. I've got a good passion and love about that. Because it helps me go through what is life. Number 5. I love the internet. I love to talk to people if I can and help people through if they've got any problems, like me. That's all I can say from today. I hope you learn anything new. I'll be looking forward to hearing from anyone out there that has the same problem like me, or you want to get to know me. Because I'm at this present moment, I'm very, very lonely. I've got no friends and stuff like that. So, be looking forward to hearing from you. So, please take care, have a lovely day, and speak to you soon. Take care now. Bye.
That's the early days of the internet. I think you can see this chap has language. There's not a deficit in language. He has problems, he has issues, and he's a lovely guy. So FOXP2 was clearly not the gene for language. I made this slide in 2018, it's now 2020, but I just want to show you how the public debate around this looks today. Simon Fisher, on Twitter, is a geneticist who knows his stuff. He was interviewed for a popular Sunday magazine 2 years ago and said, "There's no such thing as a language gene. I hate that term. No single gene can determine a person's language ability." That's what he told the press, and the press reported, "We discovered a language gene called FOXP2. Chimps have it, but with differences, which is why they'll never be able to talk." Complete and utter nonsense, attributed to poor Simon Fisher, who is a professor of language and genetics in Oxford University, and who said the exact opposite. We'll meet this kind of public misrepresentation of things as we go along a lot, and one purpose of this module is to help you in reading the popularized science that you will meet and to recognize what kind of problems there are in scientific communication.